Francis Fukuyama is een wereldberoemde politicoloog. En hij werd zo beroemd met The End of History, zijn werk uit 1992... gebaseerd op een essay wat hij eerder schreef... waarin hij betoogt dat de westerse liberale democratie de ultieme bestuursvorm is. De beste vorm. Ook in zijn nieuwe boek, Het liberalisme en zijn schaduwzijde... verdedigt hij nog altijd met verve deze bestuursvorm als de beste. Maar de vanzelfsprekende waardering daarvoor is aan het verdwijnen. De liberale democratie ligt, betoogt hij, overal ter wereld onder vuur. Het vuur komt van rechts, maar ook van links. Aldus Francis Fukuyama. Mr. Fukuyama, we are very pleased to have you as our guest. Welcome to our program.
Thank you very much.
Of course, we focused in this program on Russia and on Putin's speech. What did you see last Friday when he was speaking?
Well, it was very interesting because the focus of that speech was really not Ukraine. He was talking about the West and how the West was the source of every bad thing that's happened in human history. And he goes back several centuries. It's slavery, colonialism, repression of minorities. Of course, ignoring the fact that Russia was guilty of many of those exact same things. But he made clear that the war is really a war about ideas.
Yeah.
It's not just territory. And the idea is really the idea of freedom that the West claims as the center of what Western civilization is. And he says that's all phony.
He even used the word Satanist in Russia. And he said Russia is, as it were, leading the uprising against the Satanist West. This is about ideas.
Well, it's a bunch of crackpot ideas, quite honestly. You know, I think he actually has discovered that he's got some like-minded conspiracy theorists in the United States, in Western Europe, that are willing to believe that, you know, liberal politicians are drinking children's blood and this sort of thing. And so he's building on these fears. And I think, in a way, it shows that he is really, in a way, desperate for some way to justify, really, what's become a completely unjustifiable war.
So after this speech, it's even more essential that Russia does not win this war.
Well, I think that it's part of a larger struggle. Both Russia and China have made the argument that liberal democracies are failing, that they're an obsolete system. Putin actually said that in an interview back in 2019, that liberalism is obsolete and that their form of strong centralized government is actually on the move. And I think that it's very important to show that that's not right. And I think actually the West, NATO, has done a pretty good job of demonstrating that we still believe in something, that the idea of freedom still matters to people in the West.
Yes, this criticism on liberal democracies, it's also within the EU. I mean, like Hungary, for instance, has strong ties with Russia. How can, in your view, the EU preserve its unity?
Well, quite frankly, I think that the EU has not made use of the leverage that it has over a country like Hungary. Something like 3–4% of Hungarian GDP comes from EU subsidies, and you know, Europe up till now has really not been willing to use that leverage to actually make Hungary live up to the ideals that the EU stands for as a whole. And I think it's, you know, it's time that that happened.
EU should be stronger against Orbán.
Definitely. I mean, I think that's a problem in EU decision-making and foreign policy in general, because it depends on consensus, and a single country like Hungary can undermine that. And that's, you know, that's weakening Europe as a whole.
I see. We discussed earlier in this program solidarity. For instance, from the Dutch people with Ukraine, or European people with Ukraine. With these high rising energy bills, how can countries keep their citizens motivated for supporting Ukraine?
Well, part of it, I think, is showing that you know, there's light at the end of this tunnel, that the war is not going to go on year after year. It's not going to become another frozen conflict. And in that respect, I think what the Ukrainian military has done in the last month is incredibly important, because they broke out of this, what seemed to be a stalemate over the summer, and they've made incredible territorial gains, and they continue to do that. And it indicates that actually the war is not going to go on forever, that people will have to tighten their belts over this coming winter. It's going to be, there's no question, as your previous segment said, there's no question it's going to be very painful, you know, for workers, for entrepreneurs, for businesses, but it's for a larger, important cause, and at the end of that, you know, there will be a just resolution that's going to protect freedom.
Yeah, I heard you say this war is not going to last forever. Can you be so sure about that? Because winter is coming now, and the Russians are maybe regrouping, reinforcing their troops. How can you be sure that this is not going to last?
Nobody can predict the future, but
no.
The motivation on the Ukrainian side is so much higher than on the Russian side. They're defending their own families, their own land, you know, their own way of life. And you can just see, I mean, more Russians have tried to leave the country in the past week since this mobilization was declared than they've managed to conscript. It gives you an idea of how dedicated, you know, the average Russian is to this conflict. And why should they be?
No.
You know, why should they give up their lives so that Putin can realize this dream of a greater Russia?
Yeah, but as discussed earlier in this program too, Russia has these nuclear weapons. How do you view the nuclear threat from Putin?
I don't see any use of nuclear weapons that doesn't actually lead to the end of the Putin regime, because the West has many, many responses that it can make, and presumably that's what a lot of the diplomatic back and forth quietly behind the scenes has been emphasizing to the Russians, that if you actually set off a nuclear weapon, we have a lot of things that we can do that we haven't been. A no-fly zone, for example. This was something the Ukrainians wanted very badly. At the beginning of the war, NATO didn't give it to them, but if the Russians go ahead and do something like this, immediately, you know, that goes into effect. So I think that Putin, interested in his own personal survival, isn't going to take that kind of risk, although, you know, I have to admit that he has been, you know, quite a risk taker up till now.
I hope you're right. Let's turn to your country, the United States. The midterms elections are coming up, and in 2 years there's a possibility that Donald Trump might be re-elected as president of the US. Is democracy at stake?
Democracy is absolutely at stake in the United States. I mean, there maybe a third of American voters believe that the last election was stolen based on a total lie, you know, that was concocted by Donald Trump. He actually tried to encourage his armed supporters to storm the Capitol on January 6th. We now know, as a result of the committee hearings in Congress, that this was a plot that he had planned out well in advance. And what's really, I mean, I think the sickness is that many Republicans simply don't want to admit that this is what happened. That they want to sweep it under the rug and say, oh, this was just a peaceful demonstration, people exercising their free speech rights, when it really was an attempted violent coup d'etat. And so they're getting ready to do this again. They're trying to put officials in place that will be able to manipulate the counting of votes in 2024. And that is probably one of the most basic institutions of any democracy. I didn't think that, honestly, the United States would get to a point where such a basic institution would come under threat, but I think it is right now.
This is very serious, what you're saying. In fact, you're saying maybe we should be more worried about Donald Trump than Vladimir Putin.
Well, the two of them are linked. You know, Donald Trump has never been able to criticize Putin. He's been given the opportunity on many occasions, but I think that he sees in Putin this strong man that doesn't have to worry about legal rules, judges, the media. And conversely, Putin sees Trump as an ally, somebody that was ready to pull out of NATO had he been reelected in 2020. And so they really have an alliance going.
Yeah. In your book, you're supporting liberalism, and you argue that not only the right is a threat to liberalism, but the left as well. Why?
Well, I think that on the left, you have a form of identity politics that has emerged that starts out with a very important emphasis on issues like race, ethnicity, immigrant status, gender, sexual orientation. But it's led to a kind of intolerance, especially in places like university campuses or in the media, where they simply don't want actually freedom of speech, you know, when it comes to those topics, and it imposes a kind of orthodoxy on people that is very fundamentally illiberal.
This is woke behavior, what you're pointing at?
That's one word to describe it, and I think that it also points to a different kind of society in which we are not judged as individuals, but by what group we're born into, and that is fundamentally not the way that a liberal country organizes itself.
No, so what exactly is the danger from the left side for democratic liberalism is that it's like different opinions and the autonomy of the individual is no longer allowed.
Well, autonomy, yes, on certain issues. It gets focused on these personal questions of sexuality, of gender, and of race and ethnicity, and it becomes very difficult to talk honestly about some of those subjects. I think that's the real problem, and I can see that, in my own students who really shy away from discussions of those kinds of issues.
Yes, they shy away from that. They can't cope with different opinions?
It's hard. It's hard because there is really a kind of dominant opinion. Now, I want to make clear, this kind of attack on liberalism, I think, is nothing like the right-wing attack, right? Because the right-wing attack in 2 years could lead to a real breakdown of American democracy, and nothing like that is happening on the left. But it is a more, it's also an important cultural shift towards intolerance. And
I'm not sure if I heard you mention it or not, but immigration, isn't that a subject also where the left maybe did not do what it should do?
Well, look, I think that there's a perfectly reasonable position on immigration that can be taken in Europe, in the United States, which basically says we're a liberal society, we welcome people that come from outside and want to be part of us, but we also believe that that's a process that needs to be under political control. And as a democratic society, we can decide, who gets to be a citizen and the conditions under which people move. That position, I think, is contested by people on the left who basically say that, there's a universal right to move anywhere you want, and that's really what's putting things under strain.
So the left should speak out louder here, or more precise, and say there are limits to the number of people we can let in.
Well, for example, the Democratic Party in the United States, it's very reluctant to say that we need stronger border enforcement or that we actually need to control immigration. So yes, they can definitely speak more loudly about that.
All right. To conclude, global democracy, you write, is under pressure. We talked about Russia and the EU, the left and the right. In the long term, what do you see as the biggest threat to liberal democracy?
Well, it's hard to pick right now because I think there's a number of big ones. The internal populist threat is clearly big, but I think China, in many ways, is a more difficult competitor than Russia because it's bigger, it's got a modern economy, it can deal with modern technology in a way that Russia really hasn't been able to. And it's also more cautious, which is good and bad. I mean, it's not going to launch an immediate war, but on the other hand, it's going to move when it's ready. And I think that that's a challenge that is going to be with us for many years to come.
The Chinese challenge. Thank you so much, Mr. Fukuyama, for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Bedankt voor het kijken. Vond je dit een goed gesprek? Vergeet dan niet te abonneren. Een like of een reactie achterlaten kan natuurlijk ook. Of bekijk een van de andere interviews op dit kanaal.